Now, you could get by just by being quiet and living an upright life on your own. But we're called to something higher. We're called to be part of this great movement, to be leaders. You're called to be leaders of this movement. And that means it takes spiritual strength. You've got to attend to that. The development of your own interior lives. Prayer. It's critical. It's important. Thirdly, your intellectual formation is so vital. At the end of the day, this is a war of ideas. It's a struggle about beliefs, just as the great struggle over slavery was a war of ideas. The great struggle over segregation and other forms of racial injustice was a fight about ideas. This, too, is a battle of ideas. The good news is it's always easier to make the argument for what's true than to make the argument for what's false. Whoever arranges these things has put a thumb on the scales on our side by giving us the facts. But you need to know them. If you're to be effective and successful with the talents God has given you, then you have to make the effort to learn the elementary facts of human embryogenesis so that you can make the case in the public square for the basic biological humanity of the child in the womb or in the petri dish. And beyond that, since the folks on the other side who are with it understand perfectly well that they lose on the scientific facts, you need to be prepared to make the philosophical argument that every member of the human family, certainly without respect to race or ethnicity or sex, but equally without respect to age or size or location or stage of development or condition of dependency, possesses profound, inherent, and equal dignity. You need to know how to make the argument, and not simply in religious terms. An argument that's accessible to any person of goodwill, any reasonable person of goodwill, for the inherent dignity of the human being and indeed of all human beings. So prepare yourselves intellectually. That doesn't mean you all have to do what I do. You don't have to be professional academic philosophers. But fortunately, you don't have to be professional academic philosophers in order to understand the basic facts of human embryogenesis and the reasoning behind the proposition that if any of us has inherent dignity, all of us have it. If we have it as adults, we have it as adolescents and as children and as infants and as fetuses and as embryos. The case is there. It's relatively easy to make, but you need to be able to make it. And then, in whatever domain you're working in, for many of you it'll be the domain of the law, relying on those resources, strengthened in your moral character, strengthened in your spiritual development, strengthened intellectually, you will be able to go out there and make the case against the best that the other side has to offer in this noblest of noble causes. Thank you for what you're doing. Congratulations to you for being part of this.
Robby's happy to take some questions, particularly from law students who have any thoughts about or need any, want to ask any questions about preparing for the great battle, or when you're already engaged with it.
Yes.
Not a law student.
That's okay.
That's okay. You can knock down all those law students' hands at once.
I liked the point that you mentioned about being able to make the argument in non-religious terms, which is something that I've always, as a Catholic, I've always found difficult explaining to someone who's an avowed atheist, for example. What resources would you recommend for looking into that?
Well, my friend Sam Casey just reminded me to plug my book. And actually, it's the right answer to your question. What's the opposite of humble? As to say so. Chris Donaldson and I wrote a book which was published in 2008 called Embryo, A Defense of Human Life. And the book lays out George Weigel is here. What am I doing speaking, Brother George?
What you usually do. Some length, as I
But I can't tonight, so I have to take over. Embryo makes the case, first, for the proposition that as a biological fact, a matter of biological fact, from the earliest embryonic stage, what we have is a whole living member of the species, Homo sapiens, needing nothing more than what any human being at any stage of development needs, which is a hospitable environment and a source of nutrition, to develop by an internal dynamic, not by some extrinsic mechanism, but by an internal dynamic from the embryonic into and through the fetal, infant, child, and adolescent stages, and ultimately into his adulthood with his unity and determinateness and identity intact, which is why in the fact that is the most deadly to the other side, of all the facts, this is the one most deadly to the other side, such that we can honestly say, every single person who's alive today, every adult in this room, I was once an embryo, just as I was once an adolescent, and before that a child, and before that an infant, and before that a fetus, I was once an embryo. It's never, as a biological matter of fact, true to say I was an ovum, or a sperm cell, or a skin cell that was used in a cloning procedure to create a new human being. But I was once an embryo. Now, none of that relies on the Bible, the authority of the patristic fathers, the teaching of a pope, or anything like that. Those are just basic facts of science. Then for the second question, well, okay, we've got a human being, but do we have a person? Well, there you do need a philosophical argument. And Chris and I, in the book Embryo, lay out the case for believing that if any of us has human dignity, then all of us must have it, because if there is such a thing as human dignity, it's inherent. It follows from the kind of thing we are, that is a rational animal organism, as Aristotle once put it, a human being, and not from some accidental quality that some human beings have and others don't have, and that some have to a greater degree than others. So the only way to account for the basic moral beliefs that almost all normal people, I mean, leave Peter Singer out of this for a moment, but all normal people have, is essentially with the view that human beings have dignity by virtue of being human beings. That's why we speak of human rights, rights you have by virtue of being a human being. Now, just to correct one little aspect of the way you put the question, I said we need to be prepared to make the case for human life at all stages of development not only in religious terms. I didn't say not in religious terms. There is a place for religious language, for religiously informed moral judgment in public life. We lost our great friend, Father Richard John Newhouse, last year. Of course, he was the greatest of all advocates for that proposition. I don't deny it. I affirm it. So we shouldn't allow the other side to get away with the proposition that if there's religious language involved, it's illegitimate. Or if there's religious teaching or drawing on the wisdom of religious traditions, that's illegitimate. We don't want to play that game. But we do need to be prepared to be able to make the case in terms that do not, for people who do not respect religious authority, that do not appeal to religious authority. I do find in most cases that Catholics tend to find that quite natural because of the association of Catholicism with the natural law tradition. More and more evangelicals are finding it that way too. Evangelicals are getting more and more comfortable with the language of natural law thinking. So I don't think that we have the divide that we found 20 years ago in the pro-life movement between those who were willing to make the case in secular terms and those who just aren't comfortable talking in secular terms about things like this. Other questions?